The moment the envelope passed from one hand to another inside the crimson drawing room at Sandringham, no one spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was ceremonial, deliberate. And when Catherine opened it, seated alone before the fire, her posture perfect, her gaze steady, even the flicker of flames seemed to pause. Inside was not merely a document. It was a declaration of legacy. King Charles III, in an act few within the palace walls had anticipated, had signed the formal transfer of oversight and strategic influence over the Duchy of Cornwall, the crown's most valuable estate, to Catherine, Princess of Wales. Valued at over £1 billion, the duchy had always passed from male heir to male heir. Until now. The ink was still drying, but the meaning had already seared through the palace corridors. This, he had told his private secretary earlier that day, is not just about land. This is about the future. And so it began. Not with fanfare, but with quiet finality. A transition of power, cloaked not in titles, but in trust. Not announced from balconies, but whispered through lineage. To the public, the narrative would be soft, a gesture of appreciation from a king to his daughter-in-law after her triumphant recovery, a private reassurance, a symbolic promotion. But inside the House of Windsor, it was seen for what it truly was, a tectonic shift. Even Queen Camilla, usually composed to the point of mystery, was said to have paused upon hearing the news. "He's given her the keys," she whispered to a confidant, "the real ones." The Duchy of Cornwall wasn't just rolling green hills and ancient titles. It was the financial engine of the royal family, the lever behind private projects, strategic modernization, and at times influence over parliamentary optics. By giving Catherine control, or even shared governance, Charles was making a choice that went beyond sentiment. He was redrawing the map of power. She hadn't asked for it. That was the first thing they all agreed on. There had been no quiet lobbying, no clever maneuvering. Catherine had simply endured, with dignity, with silence, and somehow, in that stillness, she had commanded more than any public speech could offer. It wasn't the first time Charles had defied expectation. But never like this. To some, it felt premature. William, after all, was next in line. Yet sources close to the king confirmed that this move had been brewing for months, maybe even years. He sees something in her, one aide confessed. Not just grace, strategy, a long view. Those closest to Catherine remained silent, as always. But within her circle, the meaning was clear. This was not a gift for surviving illness. This was an appointment born of observation, of countless quiet conversations between father-in-law and daughter-in-law, about duty, about modernization, about the weight of the crown in an age of skepticism. In private, Charles had often lamented the rigidity of the monarchy. "We mustn't be an exhibit," he once told Catherine during a secluded walk in Balmoral's gardens. "We must adapt, or we ossify." It was perhaps then that she spoke plainly, her voice low but unwavering. "Then let us reshape it from within, not loudly, not all at once, but with intention." Now, months later, that philosophy had manifested into signature and seal. The monarch had placed his faith not in force, but in foresight. And Catherine, composed, recovering, quietly resolute, had become the quiet center of that storm. The implications were vast. Would she now oversee the duchy's strategic direction, influence its investments, modernize its structure? All signs pointed to yes. And if she succeeded, if she proved not only competent but visionary, the question would no longer be whether she could lead, but how long before she must. The monarchy, after all, does not always shout its changes. Sometimes it simply hands over an envelope. The room and waits for history to catch up. The camera, positioned at a respectful distance, captured her in a frame of soft light and steady silence. Catherine sat before the lens not as a princess, but as a woman on the precipice of truth. Her voice, when it came, was neither trembling nor dramatic. It was calm, the kind of calm forged in fire. "This is not the future I envision for myself," she said, pausing only slightly. "But I will meet it with resilience." And with that, the veil lifted. The nation learned that the Princess of Wales, the enduring figure of elegance, poise, and serene certainty, was battling cancer. The words were few, the tone unwavering, but the impact thundered across Britain. In homes, in schools, in the corridors of power, the same stunned silence settled. Catherine, the constant, was unwell, and suddenly the kingdom felt more fragile. But this was not the story of defeat. It was the beginning of a different kind of leadership. Behind palace walls, the revelation marked a shift not only in public expectation, but in the private rhythm of royal life. Catherine withdrew from engagements. She missed trooping the color. Garden parties passed without her presence. Yet even in absence, she was not invisible. She sent messages to cancer patients. She met quietly with children in hospital wings. She wrote letters in her own hand, each signed not as a princess, but simply as Catherine. Those who saw her described her as luminous through the haze of illness, poised even as the weight of chemotherapy pressed against her strength. And through it all, one image remained constant: a mother, shielding her children not from truth, but from fear. She made it her mission to protect their joy, a palace aide said, even when her own world narrowed to hospital rooms and sleepless nights. William was never far. He accompanied her to appointments, stood behind her in every statement, and held the line against speculation. He reminded the press, gently at first, then firmly, that this was a private battle. Their sanctuary would not be breached. But the world wanted more. Whispers began to swirl. Why was she absent from this event? Why no new photo here? The vacuum invited vultures. And so, when Catherine chose not to attend a prominent youth garden party on the 16th of June 2025, the headlines erupted. Cancer returns. Kate vanishes again. Where is the princess? Within hours, social media fed on rumor. Speculation spiraled. Had she collapsed? Been hospitalized? Was the marriage crumbling? But the truth, as ever with Catherine, was quieter and infinitely more human. She was at a school auditorium. Dressed in jeans and a soft blue blouse, she sat among other parents, clutching Charlotte's hand while George balanced snacks on his lap. They were there for Louis, the youngest, playing Simba in a primary school production of The Lion King. She didn't miss the palace. She didn't need a tiara. She needed to clap, loudly, lovingly, for the small boy in the lion costume. Later that evening, a close friend would say, she wasn't making a statement. She was just being mum. The palace issued a rare, sharp rebuttal. Reports regarding the princess's health are entirely false and deeply irresponsible. She is recovering well and continues to focus on her family. William's response was colder. You do not speculate about illness. You do not prey on quiet. But Catherine herself said nothing. She let the photos from the school play speak. She let her silence stretch, not as avoidance, but as strength. Because by then she had learned, true power lies not in presence, but in intention. And in the days that followed, as the noise faded and support surged, something remarkable happened. A shift. People stopped speculating. They started defending. The hashtag DocStrong surged across platforms. Strangers posted stories of survival. Parents of cancer patients said they saw themselves in her journey. One child held up a sign, "My mum fights too, like Princess Kate." Catherine never shared the details of her treatment, but she shared something more enduring, the quiet resolve of someone who refused to be defined by adversity. And in doing so, she redefined what it meant to lead. Not with speeches, not with processions, but by showing up where it mattered most. In the darkened rows of a school theater, beneath string lights and papier-mâché trees, where a boy roared and a mother clapped with tears she never let fall. This was the war she chose to fight, and she won it, not in front of a camera, but in the eyes of her children. And the world followed. The morning after the garden party scandal, Kensington Palace corridors were hushed, but not with panic, with calculation. Something had shifted. The tabloids had gone too far. And while the statement issued the night before had been crisp and controlled, the fury in Prince William's voice lingered in the air like smoke. But Catherine, she moved on. She had always known that silence came with a price. When one withdraws from public view, others rush to fill the void. That void had become a canvas for chaos, painted in wild speculation, splashed with headlines more concerned with clicks than truth. But Catherine was already playing a longer game. In the days that followed, images quietly surfaced, not of official engagements, but of human moments. A blurry shot of her helping George with his bike in Windsor Great Park. A candid smile caught outside a small bookstore in Norfolk. She didn't hide. She reframed. Because Catherine understood something few royals had dared admit. The power of visibility lies not in grand events, but in choice. When she appeared again in public, it wasn't at a state function or balcony appearance. It was at a community center for young cancer patients. She wore a simple dress. Her hair, slightly shorter, tucked neatly behind one ear. And when a child reached up to touch her wristband, she knelt without hesitation and whispered something only they heard. The photos went viral within minutes. Not staged, not strategic, simply present. One image captured her holding a hand-painted card that read, "You are not alone." It wasn't addressed to her. She was delivering it from one survivor to another. Reporters who had once questioned her absence were now reevaluating their stories. The tone shifted from skepticism to reverence. She didn't retreat, one columnist wrote. She returned on her own terms. Behind the scenes, something far more profound was unfolding. King Charles had been watching, not through newspapers, but through moments. He had seen how she weathered the headlines, how she guarded the children, how she deflected chaos with stillness. And in that stillness, he saw an echo of himself, but stronger, more evolved. Their conversations in those weeks grew longer, less formal. Charles spoke not as monarch to consort, but as father to daughter, survivor to survivor. "You didn't answer the critics," he remarked one evening after dinner. "I didn't have to," she replied. "They weren't really asking questions." It was in that space, the space between the rumor and the truth, that Charles made his choice. He had spent decades navigating a monarchy entangled in protocol and tradition, but Catherine offered something different. Intuition refined by experience, and loyalty tempered by pain. And so, quietly, plans began to form. The duchy was more than land and income. It was the engine that could drive reform, if guided properly. Charles had once hoped William would be that reformer. But William was already burdened. The crown waited for him. Catherine had room to lead. Palace insiders noted the shift almost immediately. Catherine began attending more strategic briefings, not as observer, but contributor. Economic advisors were surprised by her pointed questions. Staff noted she carried a well-worn notebook, marked with tabs and annotations. She was preparing. But not everyone approved. Some senior courtiers muttered about propriety, that a consort, however beloved, had no place in the engine room of monarchy, that oversight of the duchy belonged to heirs, not wives, that tradition was being discarded under the guise of empathy. But tradition was never meant to be a cage. And Charles knew that better than anyone. "She has the eyes of the people," he told one confidant. "But more than that, she has the mind for this." In a monarchy defined by whispers, Catherine had become the loudest voice, without ever raising hers. The scandal of her absence had been intended to unravel her. Instead, it unveiled her. What was meant to be her undoing became her coronation in silence. The moment she chose her son's school play over palace gardens was not a lapse in duty. It was a redirection of it. And in that choice, she reminded the world, and the crown itself, that leadership begins not with obligation, but with conviction. Not with spectacle, but with truth. And sometimes, the most powerful act a royal can make is to simply show up, unannounced, where they are needed most. It began with a ledger. Not a royal decree, nor a portrait unveiling, but a single leather-bound ledger discreetly placed on Catherine's desk in a private office within Kensington Palace. It bore the seal of the Duchy of Cornwall and a simple title, Strategic Holdings Review, Q1. She opened it without hesitation, because by the time the world realized Catherine had taken on a new role, she had already begun the work. Gone were the days when royal consorts were confined to ribbon cuttings and carefully staged hospital visits. This time, the crown demanded more. And Catherine, who had spent over a decade studying the rhythms of royal life from the periphery, was ready to step into its center. King Charles's decision had not been ceremonial. It was operational, tactical. A shift not just in title, but in the architecture of royal power. She was now, effectively, the strategic steward of the monarchy's greatest private asset. The Duchy of Cornwall, a 1,000-year-old institution worth more than £1 billion, was no longer merely a future inheritance for Prince William. Under Catherine's oversight, it would become the testing ground for the next generation of royal relevance. Insiders were stunned. One senior courtier remarked, "It's the kind of move that doesn't just bend tradition, it rewrites it." The duchy was vast. Farms, estates, investments, green initiatives, housing projects, all under royal scrutiny, all with public implications. And now, all flowing through a woman once seen as simply the king's daughter-in-law. But this, Charles believed, was precisely the point. He had watched Catherine endure the crucible of illness. Not publicly, not theatrically, but with a composure that defied pity and invited something rarer, respect. And in those quiet moments, in hospital corridors and family dinners, in strategy meetings and private counsel, he saw in her the very quality the monarchy had long lacked: adaptability. Catherine didn't want to tear the institution down. She wanted to refine it, humanize it, prepare it. She began with questions. How were duchy funds supporting sustainability? Were housing projects meeting modern standards of inclusion? Could farm holdings be tied to mental health initiatives? She linked lines on a balance sheet to lives on the ground. Royal accountants were startled. Her fluency in data, her pointed notes in margins, her insistence that behind every number was a name. This was not the approach of a figurehead. This was the instinct of an operator. Still, not all welcomed the shift. Traditionalists bristled. Some whispered about overreach. Others feared optics, that Catherine's growing authority might outshine William's steadier path. But William? He stood firmly behind her. This isn't about rivalry, he told a trusted friend. This is about readiness. And she's ready. He'd seen the late-night reading, the quiet consultations with policy advisors, the hours spent mapping out community investment strategies. He knew, better than anyone, that Catherine's mind had long been working at this altitude. And so, as headlines speculated and courtiers hesitated, Catherine simply continued. She convened small working groups on HR reform inside the royal household. She initiated early proposals on well-being frameworks for palace staff. She sketched out pilot schemes linking the duchy's resources with child development programs she'd championed for years. Her style was neither authoritarian nor apologetic. She listened, deliberated, and then acted with precision. She doesn't command the room, said one insider. She aligns it. For Catherine, leadership wasn't about volume. It was about clarity. And through that clarity, she was redefining what it meant to be a consort in the 21st century. No longer a symbol, a strategist, no longer standing beside the monarchy, standing within it. And as Charles watched the transition unfold, he saw not disruption, but continuity, reimagined. This was not a break from tradition. It was its evolution. And in Catherine, the crown had found something rare. A leader born not of ambition, but of circumstance, shaped not by inheritance, but by intention, one who had been tested and who had chosen again and again not to be served, but to serve. From behind the veil of duty, she had stepped forward, and now the throne's strongest voice belonged to the one who had never asked to speak, but who had always been listening. While the world focused on Catherine's absence, her illness, her return, something far more meticulous was taking place behind the scenes. Preparation. Not the kind broadcast to tabloids or hinted at through fashion choices, but quiet, deliberate groundwork woven into the fabric of her recovery. As her body healed, her mind sharpened, and while many saw rest, she was constructing something else entirely. Readiness. Every morning began the same. At a modest desk near the east-facing window of her private study, Catherine opened the day with reports, financial assessments of the duchy, white papers on sustainable development, case studies on workforce engagement in modern institutional structures. The room was not filled with jewels or royal portraits, just spreadsheets, highlighters, and a single mug with the words, "Keep going," etched along the rim. She didn't wait for permission, said one palace advisor. She assumed responsibility the way others assume inheritance. Throughout her treatment, Catherine quietly enrolled in tailored briefings led by economists, governance experts, and human capital consultants, all sworn to strict confidentiality. She wasn't content with ceremonial understanding. She wanted mastery. Mental health frameworks, ESG investment principles, conflict mediation inside organizational hierarchies. Catherine studied not as a royal, but as a reformer. Her lived experiences shaped her lens. The pain of illness, the protective instinct of motherhood, the weight of public scrutiny, all translated into a deep conviction. If the monarchy was to survive, it had to first understand what its people endured. Her work was not isolated. Trusted palace staff began noticing shifts, proposals left on desks overnight, annotations scrawled in the margins of quarterly reports. Questions raised about investment allocations and staff wellness simultaneously. She'd flag a line item about property revenue, said one staffer, and then ask why there wasn't on-site counseling available to employees managing evictions. That's how her mind works, always connecting the operational to the emotional. Catherine's strength lay in the duality: data and empathy, efficiency and warmth. It was in a late April meeting, closed door, minimal attendees, where she first outlined her vision aloud. No press, no cameras, just a flip chart, a soft-spoken voice, and 5 palisades tasked with listening. She spoke of inclusion, of loyalty earned, not inherited, of a monarchy that made sense to the child watching from afar, the nurse working a night shift, the gardener on duchy land who'd never once met a royal. She didn't quote philosophers. She quoted parents, survivors, volunteers. She didn't ask for applause. She asked for partnership. One advisor, seasoned and cynical, left the room silent. Later, he'd admit, "I've never seen anyone plan a legacy so gently and with such terrifying precision." At home, her children saw a mother who had changed, not softer, but more still, more focused. George watched her study and began asking questions about responsibility. Charlotte asked if women could be kings. Louis, ever candid, would tell visitors, "Mummy reads boring books, but she laughs a lot now." Behind those laughs, however, was a determined arc, because Catherine knew the storm wasn't over. That leadership wasn't a coronation. It was a series of choices, some unpopular, some unseen, repeated with quiet consistency. She chose to learn, not assume. She chose to listen before declaring. She chose to work, even when no one was watching. And that, in the most unceremonious way, made her the most formidable figure in the palace. Not because she demanded it, but because, while others spoke of service, she lived it. Every lesson, every briefing, every moment spent in pain became part of the architecture of a new monarchy, one not built on spectacle, but on substance. And at the center of it, Catherine was not waiting to become something. She already was. It wasn't the title. It wasn't the estate. It wasn't even the role. What truly fortified Catherine's rise, what gave it weight beyond institution and ceremony, was the presence of those who stood with her when no one was watching. Family. In the quiet interludes between strategy meetings and medical appointments, Catherine found her true stronghold not in the gilded halls of monarchy, but in the intimate, unshakable devotion of those closest to her. William had been the constant, not the prince in uniform, nor the heir in waiting, but the husband who held her hand in waiting rooms, who kept the house quiet so she could sleep, who read bedtime stories to their children when her voice failed. To outsiders, he was poised and polished. But inside their home, he was simply the man who ensured she never walked alone. "She is my anchor," he confided once during an off-record moment with a longtime friend. But when she drifted into silence, I learned to become hers. His pride in her wasn't performative. It was reverent. In private, he often marveled at her determination. She doesn't fight with anger. She fights with grace, and it's so much stronger. Their children, too, had felt the ripple of her resilience. George, the observant eldest, took to asking questions with solemn eyes. He began noting her habits, mirroring her tone when she spoke calmly to doctors or staff. He didn't ask if she was sick. He asked what she needed. Charlotte, tender yet sharp, offered comfort in the smallest gestures. "Mommy, you're so strong," she whispered once, placing a hand on Catherine's arm while brushing her hair back with the other. And Louis, young enough to see the world in symbols, brought her a crumpled painting one afternoon. A woman in a cape, arms raised high. In bright red crayon across the top, it read, "Super Mommy." She framed it. But perhaps the most unexpected bond formed in the shared silence between Catherine and King Charles. Both had faced private battles. Both had watched the press dissect their absences. Both had learned that illness, while isolating, could also illuminate. In the months following her diagnosis, Charles began inviting her to more one-on-one lunches. They didn't always speak of duty. Sometimes they spoke of music, of solitude, of legacy. It was during one such lunch, simple soup, no press, just 2 survivors, that Charles lifted his glass and offered a rare, unguarded toast. "To strength," he said, "the kind no one sees until they must." From that moment, their relationship deepened, not as sovereign and subject, as human beings weathered by burden. Camilla, too, extended quiet solidarity. Once distant, perhaps even cautious, she became a guide, not in public declarations, but in late-night texts and whispered encouragements in palace corridors. "She taught me," Catherine once told a confidant, "that grace isn't never breaking. It's learning when to lean." And Catherine leaned, briefly, but with trust. Together, this family, bound not just by blood but by choice, formed a net around her. One that caught her when her steps faltered, one that lifted her when the noise outside threatened to drown the quiet inside. They protected her, and through them, she protected her purpose. Because what Catherine understood, perhaps better than anyone, was that leadership rooted in love is unshakable, not performative, not conditional, but enduring. Her rise was not solitary. It was woven through with the hands of those who saw her, not as icon, not as consort, but as Catherine, woman, mother, daughter, partner. And in their belief, she found a fire steadier than ambition. She found reason. She found legacy. And from that quiet circle of devotion, she stepped forward, not above them, but because of them. A leader forged not by power, but by those who loved her enough to let her become it. The crown never announced it. There were no proclamations, no balcony waves, no velvet-lined declarations. But those who watched closely, those who understood how monarchies truly move, knew something had shifted. Catherine was no longer simply the Princess of Wales. She was the architect of a new monarchy. When King Charles entrusted her with the duchy and a deeper administrative role within the institution, it was not just a gesture of recovery or gratitude. It was a vision in motion, a declaration not of inheritance, but of intention. And from that intention, Catherine began to shape the very bones of the royal family's future. The Duchy of Cornwall, long treated as a financial vessel, became in her hands a mechanism for modernity. Catherine began linking investments to environmental standards, reevaluating land use in favor of social housing, and advocating for sustainability metrics aligned with British scientific consensus. But the reforms did not stop with property. Inside the palace, she initiated a full audit of human resource practices. From outdated employee training to the lack of mental health infrastructure among royal staff, Catherine spearheaded a quiet revolution. Compassionate, deliberate, unavoidable. Her influence wasn't felt in headlines. It was seen in meeting minutes, in newly appointed staff roles, in the subtle but undeniable shift in how the royal household functioned. She wasn't a figurehead anymore. She was a force. Senior aides noted the cultural change almost instantly. "It's not that she's louder," said one. "It's that people listen differently now. When Catherine speaks, it feels like the future is already happening." And yet, with all this, she never abandoned what made her beloved, the human connection. She continued to meet with young mothers in shelters, with nurses after long shifts, with children facing the same battles she had once quietly endured. Her advocacy for early childhood development expanded to include family mental health and postnatal support systems. She integrated policy with empathy. Each visit, each reform, each quiet policy note came with the same underlying message. The crown must evolve, not just to survive, but to serve. Younger generations began to see her not as a relic of tradition, but as a model of transformation. In a world skeptical of hierarchy and symbolism, she offered transparency, sincerity, and focus. Her presence calmed, her policies acted. Even within the family, her stature grew. She no longer walked a step behind, she walked beside, sometimes ahead. William welcomed it. In private, he referred to her as the true pulse of the palace. Their partnership was no longer simply matrimonial. It was institutional, strategic, anchored in trust. But perhaps the most profound legacy she began to shape was symbolic. For centuries, royal consorts were meant to be graceful, charitable, and silent. Catherine remained graceful. She remained charitable, but she would not be silent. Her voice, steady, studied, sincere, became the quiet engine of reform. In private, Charles often reflected that her rise had become his greatest achievement, not because she took power, but because she embodied a monarchy that no longer feared giving it away. And so, a new chapter began, not written in gold ink, but in revised spreadsheets, staff wellness initiatives, and the renewed trust of a watching public. Catherine did not wear a crown. She didn't need to. She wore conviction. And as she moved forward, flanked by family, grounded by purpose, the monarchy followed. Not as a relic, but as a living institution capable of growth. This was not the reign of a queen. It was the rule of a legacy, one built in silence, fortified in love, and executed with the clarity of a woman who understood. To truly lead, one must first understand who they serve. And Catherine understood. Not because she was told, but because she listened. And because of that, history will listen to her.
the